Hi everyone, welcome. Down here my wormery, and what you see here in front of you is a tray full of mostly potato peels. There's a day's worth of coffee in here. Even a banana peel. Kind of blends in because it's not really very yellow anymore. A little bit of a boring brownish feeding. Last time the color of choice was blue because what the worms got was blueberry. And the worms that I'm referring to are the ones that live in this tub right here. There were worms that I recruited from my outdoor compost barrel. My compost barrel was in need of repair, so I had to empty it. And a whole bunch of material that was like almost pretty much finished castings, very, very damp, and I knew it was loaded with worms. I brought it indoors, let it dry. After it had dried, I separated the worms. Instead of returning the worms back out into my compost barrel, while I felt like there was plenty of worms out there anyway, I figured I'd just keep them in here for a while. It was meant to be a temporary arrangement, thinking that they'd make their way back out into the compost barrel in time, but I think the compost barrel's doing quite well without them, and it's kind of nice having them around. So we're going to probably keep them down here in the wormery from now on. I think that decision was made a while ago, to be honest, but I'm going to get a glove on, we're going to get that bin up on the bench, we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. Sometimes I like to jot down a little bit of information about the system that we're going to check in on, just so that viewers can put things into context. Maybe you got a bin that's got similar worms, or a bin with a similar population size, or has received a similar number of feedings, or something along those lines. And hopefully what I'm demonstrating here is something that people can relate to, back to their own worm bins. It's also really exciting when you hear about people mentioning how they consider the videos as a good way to sort of demystify the worm composting activity and sort of take away the uncertainties by demonstrating how easy it can be. So it's really nice to hear that people adopt the activity because of what they've seen here. That's something I really like to hear. I don't know, ever since I took the cover off, I can't seem to get my eyes off this one little worm here. Doesn't seem very active. Oh, seems to be moving a little bit, but that whole end of him is dry. Is he even moving? Is it just recoil? I don't know. It's so strange. So strange when a worm dies. I don't know why it seems like such a such an extraordinary thing that needs so much of my attention. Especially if it's not happening in great amounts. You would have to imagine that it's just part of the natural process and shouldn't be seen as such a out of the ordinary occurrence. But it does sort of, I guess make you reflect on what you got going on, any possibility to improve things, to see if you can come up with a bin of, immortal worms that'll never die. Obviously that's not in the cards. Like we do sometimes, we're collecting up the stuff on the top surface, some of these larger chunks of bedding and whatever. Sometimes I feel like without that there, it's just a little bit better representation of what the bin's really like. Because now I feel like what I'm looking at is much closer to what's really down in the system. So if we were to excavate a little bit, we would probably see fairly decent consistency. Now we're starting to see some worms that are actually moving, which is good. The one thing I remember about this bin last time, I think I even might have titled the video accordingly, about how I felt like I was observing so many little tiny worms in this system. Like I had kind of unearthed a batch of material, sort of like this, and then I guess I made the observation how, at least on that occasion, I had only pulled out what seemed to be one or two mature worms, and everything else that I was seeing moving around was all little babies. But that was down near the feeding area. Maybe that's what we'll see in the feeding area. The coffee filter that we removed, one of the last top covering items, that was just showing us where we last fed. That's where all that blueberry is, right down the middle. Sometimes I'll want to check my outer edges of the system too when I'm visiting my bins. Like I watched the video of my check-in yesterday on one of my worm bins, and it seems like I just sort of got caught up in getting the feeding in there and putting it right down the middle like I usually do. I sort of overlooked the inspection of the outer edges of the system. I've been getting better at trying to remind myself to do that, but I remember once upon a time, sometimes I would go many check-ins before finally remembering to, take a look at how things on the outer edges are coming along. In most cases, things are quite nice. I guess what I worry about is checking in there and finding perhaps material that's gone dry or whatever, or something weird going on over there that, would have benefited from being noticed sooner, intended to sooner. And you might also notice when we're talking about the top coverings before how no plastic was used to cover this system, only a few sheets of paper. And yeah, the top surface, had some dry and neglected material out there. Even a little plant trying to grow. But you don't have to go very deep and suddenly you're in material that the worms are really very comfortable in. Lots and lots of castings in here. I guess since we did see sort of a shortage of bedding last time, we were pretty generous with the stuff, from what I remember. Pretty good quantity of bedding laid in underneath the food. We're starting to see some of it pop out here and there. The bedding was almost all paper, if not all paper, from what I remember. Because I know I came in later and I, tried to offset what I thought was perhaps a over-concentration of paper only, or perhaps a complete absence of cardboard, and I just hacked up a cardboard box and shredded that right into the existing almost purely newspaper only bedding. So I'm wondering what that bedding is going to look like down here. Sometimes it feels like the cardboard helps the paper from clumping together, but if paper's all on its own, they seem to, jumble together into these little knots. And guess what happens when you open one of these up? You see nothing but more paper. And what I'd rather see in between all these little pieces of paper is castings and worms, and I don't really like seeing this stuff all bundled together. And I guess I expected to find this when I got back in here. The reason I place it beneath the food is that, my thought is that the juices from the food will make its way down into the material onto which the food was placed and help dampen it and help, make it something that the worms will really enjoy hanging out in. At this point, I would think 10 days after the last check-in, we're probably not going to see any of that blueberry. I don't think I've seen anything that resembles blueberry, but here and there, seems like we're bumping into a few spots where the worms are quite content to still hang out over here in the fresh pile of bedding, even though it's probably been cleaned out of the food supply for a while now. Some of this stuff is more damp, and I guess that's where the worms are. Some of it is not that damp. It might benefit from a little bit more moisture coming in. I'm not sure how much moisture we can count on as far as coming out of that frozen potato that we're going to be giving them. Banana peel wouldn't have a lot of moisture content to it either, nor would that little portion of used coffee there. I try not to make it too much of a habit to add water to my systems. I'd rather introduce the moisture to my systems through the food that they get fed. But sometimes you just have to accept the fact that perhaps the most recent applications of food wouldn't have brought with them a tremendous amount of moisture, and that moisture might be lacking, and that supplementing it might be necessary. So I think that's what we're going to do. I'm going to get my water bottle out. It's just that I'm still encountering some of these large chunks, which I always feel compelled to break apart a little bit. I mean, obviously I have my supply of pre-made bedding right here. I just flashed it on the screen a moment ago, but I'm really reluctant to add more at this point since there is just so much of it down in here. Maybe we could just skip the addition of bedding this time. I mean, there is a spare filter in here. This filter can end up becoming our new replacement feeding zone indicator, meaning this filter here can also go in as bedding. So it's not to say we're not going to be giving them any bedding supplement today. We can complement their feeding with a couple extra pieces of paper to go in here alongside what's in here already, but I think that's probably the way to play it. I mean, I have really been very interested in increasing the overall volume and size of my systems. I feel like there's a lot of unused space available for us to work in here. I'm trying to move the worms into. But you know, you start to get a little sense of why I'm reluctant to go so high within my bins, because I'm already at the edge once I pile stuff up here after I open up a big enough crevasse down the middle here to apply the food. I do feel like I need to reserve some unused space just for maintenance purposes sometimes. I don't know, what do we do? Do we follow my instinct? Yeah, you know. My instinct says we're going to go for it. We're just going to grab one generous handful. I can't seem to resist. Now that this stuff's actually got cardboard in it, I think it would benefit this mixture of just paper only down here if we can blend it in a little. I think the cardboard helps things. You know, it's not to say that pieces of paper are not going to stick to the cardboard, but the cardboard by its nature is the type that's like the multiple layers with that wavy piece in between them, the corrugated cardboard. So it does seem like by its nature it's just got little air gaps and features and shapes that allow for a little bit more air pockets, a little bit more ability of the material to flake apart from one another, allow for some of this nice casting material to... Apologies for that. That was a phone call that I was expecting, so I needed to take it. Can't remember what I was talking about, sorry. Kind of lost my train of thought and I didn't feel like rewinding the last segment I was filming. I just figured before we proceed, dropping the food in here, just wanted to introduce a little bit of additional moisture down into the feeding area. This thing would be dispensing a whole lot faster if I had pumped it up sooner, but that's fine. This way I feel like I can control it a bit more. I don't think the situation's chronic or anything like that, but it does feel like just a little something, you know, a little something to help compensate for what appears to be perhaps just a little bit less moisture in here. I guess the other option would be just to, you know, lock in what exists in here already by covering with plastic or whatever. But since I like the way the results turn out, you know, with paper only coverings, perhaps it's the added airflow on the surface or something. I mean, that one worm we saw in the beginning didn't like it much up there. It was pretty dry. Who knows, maybe blending them in and getting them into some more moist material will revive them. But I don't know what to expect for that little guy that we saw in the beginning. But let's see here. We had decided to recycle the old feeding zone indicator, coffee filter, and then there was another one that I bought down. So this is also more bedding going in. Yeah, I couldn't help myself grabbing that handful of pre-made bedding material. It just seems like stuff the worms really enjoy being in. You saw as we plowed through this stuff how whenever we encountered a nice little damp pocket where there was still a little bit of moisture, how the worms were enjoying being in there. That's really what I'd like to see throughout this material, and that was the whole idea of kind of breaking it all apart, getting the clumps spread out, and introducing all that moisture. I got a feeling that'll help a lot. And then here too, we're sort of capping all that stuff off with some material which by its nature should also be bringing with it a little bit of moisture. So I think we're hopefully going to be in a little bit better shape here next time we come in. Alrighty. This will become our new feeding zone indicator. Why is it freezing? You know, I'm asking myself why is it stuck together, and I think I was already answering the question in the question. Why is it stuck together? Because it's freezing. All right, so I guess I'm getting ahead of myself there a little bit. Something about the coffee, I don't know what it is, but I always feel like if I, you know, somehow mix it with something there too, I'm not ending up with a pile of something that's just going to sit there. I could be completely wrong, but usually it's bedding that I want to mix the coffee with, so I think that's just becoming another excuse for me to bring in a little bit more of this stuff that now has a better mix, I believe, because of the cardboard I added the other day. Just seems to give the material sort of a more bulkiness. Granted, after all those little air pockets and openings start to collapse, the whole thing levels off and loses a lot of volume. Makes it look like the worms have been really busy eating when it's really just all the air gaps vanishing. But it's a fun optical illusion. So trying to think if there's anything else that we missed here. I can't resist, adding more bedding when I can, and this seemed like a great opportunity. My supply was just beefed up with the addition of all that cardboard, so I certainly had plenty of it on hand. Luckily, this stuff is also going in fairly damp, because like my last batch of that prepared bedding stuff, this batch is also fairly wet. Because while I'm preparing it and mixing it all together, I always get my spray bottle out, and I always introduce moisture as I'm mixing this stuff together. And sometimes I just don't realize. I only know afterwards when I sort of pick up the bin and feel how heavy it is. It's always the moisture that accounts for its weight. And, well, there was a little bit of this worm chow introduced right onto the coffee and blended into it. I think getting it in all over this bedding material will be something that will help drive worm activity there too. So I think I'm going to begin by covering up with material from this corner, which is where I believe we left the majority of that dry, neglected material we found out on the surface. That stuff feels like it would be a good addition to the feeding area too, but at this point it's really just covering up. Man, here's big bundles of paper. All right, and that's where the worms are hiding. I must have missed certain little patches of this stuff as I sort of nudged the feeding area outwards. Just like the idea of blending it all in. I guess my only area of concern is, is it possible that that stuff is just sitting there as like a little bit of a untapped spongy sort of material that's going to draw moisture into itself now that it's blended in with the more moist, damp castings around it? That's the main thing I worry about. Because if all this stuff was just dry and clumped together, it wasn't going to impact any of the surrounding material by sucking a bunch of moisture into itself. But now you take all that dry material and you spread it around. I don't know why, but I just get this weird feeling like maybe what we're doing here would benefit also from a little bit more sprinkling of moisture down into the system. The material really flows. It's very nice and crumbly. I think that's also got a lot to do with the fact that it might just be a little bit lacking in moisture content. Maybe the one thing we need to really take into consideration is how that poor little worm on the surface looked when we first got into the bin, and I just wouldn't want to see that happening to any more worms, especially if it's due to something I did or didn't do. And here, I guess my main concern is that some of this paper, which seems like it has the potential to want to draw moisture into itself now that it's been all spread throughout the castings, could result in some casting material that's really lacking in moisture. It's really cool though, every time you encounter one of these little bundles, luckily there's enough moisture, on it that most of them have little collections of worms hanging out in them. So maybe the situation wasn't quite as bad as I thought it could be. I guess it's just an abundance of caution, thinking that, things look so good in here, and I'm really enjoying the crumbly, flowing nature of the material, but I wouldn't want to get so caught up in it to think that, it would be forbidden for me to add moisture and kind of start causing little bits of it to clump together because of that moisture. That's perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned. Even though it seemed like every bit of the material in here, when we first got in here, was going to be able to flow right through any size screen if you wanted it to. Now we've obviously got stuff that's clumping together. But don't forget, the coverings on here are paper only. Perhaps here in the middle where the feeding zone indicator, we got a couple extra layers with the feeding zone indicator itself, helping to shield some of the evaporation here in the middle, but I really don't think that accounts for a whole lot at all in terms of protection from evaporation. Sometimes I'll even dampen the top covering papers to give the whole system a little bit extra time. All right, buddy, get back in the bin. Hanging on to its moisture, but, exposed to the air, this piece of paper is going to be dry in a couple hours, so it hardly makes any difference. I'm not even sure if it's worth the effort. So, before we go, maybe it would make sense to look at this. Oh boy, jeez. Now I'm going to get the head of my water applicator all filthy, so I think I'm going to have to chalk up getting all these things done as after the fact. After we're done filming, because that stuff's boring. Cleaning up and putting stuff away is always boring. I'll try to, you know, spare you the boringness. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. It's very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. All right, I'll take care of everything else here off camera. Take care, everyone. Thanks for watching. Bye now.